So, what are we doing here? Uh, there's a lot of outstanding RFCs, and they propose a variety of upgrades to Beanstalk, uh, which, in my opinion, is the largest upgrade to the peg maintenance model since it has gone live, in the sense that it adds a whole new dimension to what it means for Beanstalk to maintain peg. And that is worth discussion. So, not all of the RFCs that are outstanding are covered by this discussion because they're not exactly related to this major peg maintenance upgrade. But we will. I think those are going to be discussed after we have this sort of major peg maintenance discussion. So hard to know exactly what to call it, but we call it Beanstalk State Space. And the general flow is that we're going to think about what Beanstalk is doing from first principles, figure out what are the dimensions on which it should be optimizing, try to understand those dimensions. Then we're going to talk about how Beanstalk does some of this in practice, starting with the current peg maintenance model, then expanding to discussion about the new peg maintenance model that includes the liquidity to supply ratio, and then sort of tying up a bunch of loose ends regarding related content, so to speak. So, related RFCs. So, I see the question, is this a new RFC? No, this is just a discussion that sort of explains the intuition behind most of, or a significant portion of the outstanding RFCs. So, given the extent to which they change Beanstalk, or propose to change Beanstalk, figured it would be a good idea to spend the time to write it down, and then also spend the time to talk about it. So that's what we're doing here. So, without further ado, let's talk about what Beanstalk is actually doing. And the reason we call it Beanstalk State Space is that one way to think about what Beanstalk is doing from a peg maintenance perspective is that it is operating within some sort of space-time itself, where time is in seasons in some capacity. You could say time is continuous, but then it's operating in some space with respect to peg. And so by better understanding the nature of and the features of this space, in other words, the world in which Beanstalk operates, we can better understand what Beanstalk should be doing, and how Beanstalk should be doing it, given its position within space. So there's a lot that can be learned about Beanstalk by understanding the space in which it operates, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, some of this I'm going to read, some of this I'm just going to talk about. So we'll see. If people don't like the flow, feel free to chime in and we can switch it up as well. Now I'm paying attention to the chat after that disaster with the microphones earlier. Okay. So what is Beanstalk doing? Beanstalk is trying to maintain peg. Peg with respect to what? To price. So at the beginning of each season, Beanstalk adjusts various parameters autonomously. It's an autonomous stablecoin within itself in a response to its current state in an attempt to, technically regularly oscillate the bean price over its value peg indefinitely, which what that really means is maintain the peg for as long as possible, indefinitely. And, when Beanstalk is doing this, the question is, to what extent can it measure its own state and respond to it as appropriately? And obviously, a system as sophisticated as a stablecoin, in particular Beanstalk, has a lot of different moving pieces. So we're gonna talk about a lot of them today. But the two primary questions that Beanstalk asks with respect to peg maintenance are: one, how should Beanstalk classify its state at the beginning of the season? And two, how should it respond to its state at the beginning of each season in an attempt to return to an ideal state? And so, to the extent that this discussion is talking about the new seed gauge and the incorporation of the L2SR into the new peg maintenance model after the seed gauge goes live, these are the two questions which our discussion is mostly going to be focused around. I see Guy typing. Is everything all good? Is there a problem? Cool. Shout out Guy for the definition. Yeah, L2SR is liquidity to supply ratio, which we will define shortly. So, question one: how should Beanstalk classify its state at the beginning of each season? What are the relevant axes or dimensions on which Beanstalk should evaluate state? What are the important factors, so to say, in evaluating its state? Does it matter what day of the week it is? Probably not so much from a peg maintenance perspective. Which data to use to evaluate Beanstalk's current position along each axis? So once we've determined what the axes are, how should Beanstalk think about actually measuring position along each axis? What is the data available to Beanstalk that it could use to figure out what its position is? Then once we understand how to understand where Beanstalk should be, or how Beanstalk should measure its position, then the question is, well, what are the features of these axes? And then based on what we know about the shapes of these axes, the shapes and scales of these axes, we should say, what can we say about the state of the derivatives of position? So if we know position and we understand the features of these axes, what can we say about more than just position? What can we say about direction? What can we say about acceleration? And then finally, how should Beanstalk actually evaluate its position, direction, and acceleration at the beginning of each season in practice? So these are the questions we're going to try to answer around classifying state. And then the second question, how should Beanstalk respond to its state? That's something we'll leave for later on. And maybe it would have been better to have a slide talking about what those questions are. Maybe I'll skip ahead and just go through it briefly. Apologies. We're doing this a little bit on the fly. Okay, 2. How should Beanstalk respond to its state at the beginning of each season in an attempt to return to its ideal state? So once we've classified the state and really understand, Beanstalk can really understand its position in Beanstalk space or Beanstalk space-time. How should it respond? How should it act? So the questions to answer on this dimension are, what is the natural flow of state? So given what we know about what's going on, what is actually happening to Beanstalk? And then 2, what tools does Beanstalk have available to perform peg maintenance? So what can Beanstalk do given what's happening to it? Then we want to understand more deeply, how do these tools that Beanstalk has available, how does it actually affect Beanstalk? And then finally, how should Beanstalk use these tools in practice? So this is the framework for the beginning of our discussion. Hopefully, it's helpful to provide some sort of framework so that all this talking is understood in some context. So, question 1.1. What are the relevant or dimensions on which to evaluate Beanstalk state? So in other words, what are the things? I see, will the doc be shared? The doc is public. It was posted in, well, you want the latest version? They're the same. They're basically the same. That version's basically the same. Okay, so anyways, what this means is, how should Beanstalk even begin to think about what is important from a peg maintenance perspective? So first off, Beanstalk is a stablecoin protocol, and its main purpose is to oscillate P across V indefinitely. Beyond that, price, particularly for non-collateralized stablecoins, is very reflexive because when price is greater than its value peg, the systems tend to grow and pay out some sort of inflation reward. When the price is below peg, there's no reward, so people tend to leave. So price seems to be, for a lot of reasons, a very important component of peg maintenance, of course. Now, Beanstalk's primary peg maintenance mechanism up until the Seagate system has gone live, and the theoretical basis for its existence, Beanstalk is a credit-based stablecoin, is the field, the credit facility, and the ability for Beanstalk to borrow beans at a reasonable interest rate is obviously essential for the long-term health of the system. And it's hard to know what is the right metric for debt level per se, which that discussion will happen shortly. But very clearly, because Beanstalk is a debt-based system, some sort of notion of the debt level of the system it is a good idea for Beanstalk to use to determine its health or its position in space, which is a proxy for its health in the grand scheme of things. Right? Beanstalk wants to be close to its ideal state. How far away it is and its momentum towards or away from ideal state. These are the things that we're talking about here. So price seems to be very important. Debt level seems to be very important. And those were the two axes on which the original Beanstalk model was created. But over time, via the introduction of Convert and just Beanstalk running, it's become very clear that the liquidity levels of the system are very important as well in terms of determining its health. With the conversions within the silo, there's a lot of change in the health of the system as a result of just conversions. And so from this perspective, there seem to be at least three axes on which to evaluate the health of Beanstalk's overall situation or state. Now the question is, should there be any other axes considered? And as will become clear in this discussion, there are other things considered that are sort of secondary peg maintenance mechanisms, like the LP seed distribution, the distribution between various liquidity pools or silo deposits. That's a secondary peg maintenance system, or a secondary dimension of peg maintenance. It doesn't actually affect the price or the debt level or the liquidity level, the things that would determine the overall health of Beanstalk. So the question is, or at least in this case, whether Beanstalk's liquidity is against ETH or against USDC. The amount of liquidity is the important thing in terms of its overall health. The distribution of liquidity is more of a secondary component of its health. So the question becomes, is there anything that's more important? Is there anything that's more important? Like that is another primary axis on which to evaluate Beanstalk. And as of now, there doesn't appear to be any from our perspective. So that gives us three axes. And our goal is to dive into these axes and how they mix together and to understand what Beanstalk is actually doing and how it's operating within these dimensions in order to regularly cross the price over its peg for as long as possible. Okay. So we've gotten 3 dimensions. And the question then becomes, what are the actual data to use? And you could use a bunch of different things for price. You could just use something that measures the price itself. You could measure delta B, or you could measure delta V, the amount of V that would have to be bought or sold to return the price to peg. Delta B is what we're more familiar with, but you could denominate things in the value peg per se. Now, the manipulation resistance of these values, that's a separate discussion, which we'll treat lightly here, lightly later on. But the actual decision as to what Beanstalk should do with respect to price is that, it's funky. In practice, Beanstalk measures delta B for the most part. Sometimes it measures price, but typically it can just measure delta B, because if delta B is positive, that means price was also greater than V. If delta B was negative, price was less than V. So to a large extent, Beanstalk can use delta B as an indicator for price, but nonetheless, in the grand scheme of things, price is really the thing that matters to Beanstalk. Beanstalk doesn't care about delta B. Beanstalk cares about price. It does care about delta B, but that's more of a derivative of the things that it does care about, like price and liquidity level. So on the price axis, Beanstalk measures price, and that's what we're going to evaluate in terms of its that dimension, the price dimension. Second, we've got the debt level. We could use the debt to supply ratio, which is what Beanstalk currently uses. Beanstalk could use the total amount of debt outstanding and denominated in beans or V. But of course, larger systems can handle more debt. So it makes sense to denominate the debt, or to measure the debt level in terms of supply. So using the debt to supply level is probably Beanstalk's best option as we understand things today. So the debt to supply ratio, in addition to price, those are the two axes that Beanstalk uses in the current peg maintenance model. And hopefully over time, not over time, very soon, hopefully, the third dimension will come into play, which is liquidity level. And similar to debt level, we could measure the liquidity to supply ratio, or we could measure the total amount of liquidity and denominate it in beans or V. And in a similar way to debt level, the larger the system is, the more liquidity it needs to be similarly healthy. So from that perspective, the liquidity to supply ratio makes the most sense. So before we summarize our wrap, so the notes is a little funky. Excuse me. Okay. Want to just say that other secondary components of liquidity or of peg maintenance are the distribution of liquidity, like we were talking about, and in the future, potentially a distribution of liabilities. So if Beanstalk has multiple assets that it is holding peg to, there could also be a sort of a peg maintenance system with regards to those liabilities, or some sort of optimization around managing liabilities in addition to liquidity, which is already sort of a liability management system, or an asset liability management system. So anyways, where does this leave us? We've got three dimensions on which to measure Beanstalk: price, debt level, and liquidity. And we're going to measure price as a price, debt level as debt to supply ratio, and liquidity level as liquidity to supply ratio. What does this look like if we're talking about space? Well, you can think about it with some sort of zero, because they all have a zero. If we look here to the left, the origin, where you have a low L2SR and here a high L2SR, here a low price and here a high price, here a low debt level, here a high debt level, or you can, if you want to start thinking about things as happening in this way, up to you. It's all, this is more closer to where this would show like ideal equilibrium at the origin. So Beanstalk is trying to move back to the ideal spot here at the origin. Now in practice, things don't really fit into this, so easily, at least to visualize. You can sort of arbitrarily say this is where it is, but it's not so easy to visualize, as we'll see. So this is more the model in which we'll be working with. Okay. 1.2 and 1.3 have been answered, which again are what are the relevant axes and what are the data to use. Boom. 1.3, what are the features of each relevant axis? So, given that this is the space in which Beanstalk is operating, what can we learn about this space? What are the features of this space? Is it discrete or continuous? Beanstalk obviously measures things discretely at the micro level, but does it act continuously? Does it measure? Does Beanstalk measure things discretely or continuously? Does it classify things continuously or discretely? A couple different ways to think about this. The shape of each axis. We'll talk more about this, but basically the idea is, what does the axis look like? And how much is it stretched would be scale. So the shape of the axis, the shape of the space, tells us a lot about what Beanstalk is going to experience if it is in that position on that axis. So a couple things to think about. And some of this will make more sense in words. Some of it will make more sense in pictures. I'm just going to talk. I'm not going to read off of this per se. So, what are we talking about when it comes to shape? The position of Beanstalk with regards to each axis is going to exhibit some sort of force on itself with respect to position. So, just in the case of price, for example, when Beanstalk is at a price that is higher than V, higher than its value peg, there is upward pressure on Beanstalk in terms of price. And the higher that the price goes, the more upward pressure that Beanstalk experiences. And so that is reflexive. That is called reflexivity. And reflexivity looks like this upside down ball. Where if you're trying to balance a ball on top of here, it tends to just fall off. And even if you get it on top, if it has just a little bit of momentum, it's going to roll back off again. And, in the case of economics, even though Beanstalk in theory has lots of data available to it, things are very imprecise. So I'm a big fan of the metaphor of trying to, on top of a reflexive system like Beanstalk, trying to keep a ball, maybe even a small ball, on top of here. Maybe it's even over here or over here, with a leaf blower, which is obviously an imperfect way to apply force. So Beanstalk has the ability through peg maintenance to apply force, but it's gonna affect things in ways that it doesn't necessarily want it to. So it should tread lightly and apply force minimally, but of course minimize the extent to which Beanstalk enters a death spiral. So understanding this task is really the point at hand. But when it comes to shape, the question is it like this, or is it like this? Is it anti-reflexive? So imagine if Beanstalk were solving an anti-reflexive problem, and the higher price got, the more it just naturally trended back towards peg, sort of like a collateralized stablecoin that is redeemable. Where as soon as the system moves a little bit off peg, there's an arbitrage opportunity that sends it right back to peg. And so this is an anti-reflexive system. So think about how much force you would need to actually displace a system like that, assuming that it's actually collateralized. It's immense. Whereas in the case of Beanstalk, um, it's a highly reflexive system because it's uncollateralized. So the higher the price gets, the more people wanted to participate in mints. And the lower the price gets, the less healthy it looks and the more people want to dump it. So Beanstalk has a very hard problem to the the collateralized stable contracts. So we digress.
Ben, defer to you on how you want to handle questions, but there are a couple. If you're gonna wait for later, I think that totally works as well.
Sorry, hold on. In the flow, did lose track of the computer. One sec. Okay. No, at least if it's these two questions that I see so far, I'm going to hold off on responding to them just yet.
Sounds like plan.
But we'll get to them. Okay. Then there's a question of scale, which is sort of a way to understand friction. So particularly when it comes to the liquidity levels, Beanstalk is going to experience much more volatility in terms of price and debt level at lower liquidity levels. Whereas at higher liquidity levels, it's harder for Beanstalk to experience as much price volatility or reflexivity. So in practice, the relationship between shape and scale is deeply intertwined. And so understanding reflexivity and volatility, in terms of the analogy here, it's like there's some sort of force that Beanstalk that is acting on Beanstalk as a result of Beanstalk's position, and then there's some amount of ground that Beanstalk will cover or distance within space that Beanstalk will cover as a result of that force. So the force is represented by the shape, and then the distance covered is represented by the scale. And then Beanstalk's task is to come in and apply the right force to sort of counteract or to support Beanstalk's momentum given its position in space. So, what's the best way to understand all this stuff? I think from the ground up. So let's start with one dimension and then build up to two dimensions and then try to build some intuition for how this all works in three dimensions. But let's start at the bottom. So this is what price looks like. Now, this is sort of what we were talking about before, where the further from, hold on, can you see, there we go. The further from the value peg, in either direction, the more force there is acting on the state of Beanstalk with respect to price in whatever direction. And so the point is, if we're trying to just understand in a single dimension, given the price, what is the effect of price on price? These arrows represent the effect on price. Now, in short, if you can convert the lengths of these forces in this case into the slope here, and what you get is in 2 dimensions, even though it's actually still only just price, you get a visual understanding of what price looks like, what the space in Beanstalk space, the price dimension. This is some approximation of what it looks like. And what is the intuition for why this is what it looks like? Well, let's just break it down. At V, there is no minting. So there's still some sort of natural downward pressure on Beanstalk. There's minting happening slightly above V, call it V prime, and so at some unknown value V prime, there's sufficient minting to offset the natural tendency downward, or to sell below peg. Of course, because it's above V, it's not technically below peg, so V prime is probably very close to P, but they're 2 separate values. Then, and the point is that there's downward pressure at V, there's no pressure in either direction, there's no force in either direction at V prime, whereas now, if you go greater than V, the slope starts to increase. And as what this is showing is that as the price gets higher, and higher and higher, there's more reflexivity naturally with respect to price. The higher the price goes, the more upward pressure there is with respect to price. And of course, similarly, on the downside, the more the price decreases, the more downside pressure there is with respect to price. So that's where we get this upside down parabola, upside down bowl shape, which is of course way more difficult to evaluate if you're Beanstalk than if you have something like this. Okay. So, and the reason this has gravity, shout out Guy, this has gravity here, is because if you have the ball here, think about the relative effect that gravity is having on your position on this bowl or parabola. Maybe a hill is the way to think about it. Given the slope, given the steepness. So the more steep it is, the more quickly the ball is going to fall down, down to its extremes. So that's what this is trying to demonstrate. Now, a couple features on this. So I'm gonna just touch on a couple things. Q is a new parameter introduced in the seed gauge, where with respect to price, there's some price that's too high. That Beanstalk really doesn't want the price higher than this level, and Beanstalk should be aggressive when the price is higher than that. And V prime is something that hasn't really been discussed to date. So those are the new terms. Now, in the document, we have consideration of the shape up until the third derivative, which is not just whether or not the bowl is shaped like this or like this, whether it's upside down or I guess right side up if you want. But also how much is the slope changing? What is the rate of change of the slope? And is the slope changing faster or slower? And then there's the scale. Now, the price is just going to tend to be more volatile around P. Meaning that for a given marginal change in price, if the price changes 1,000th of a point, or call it 1/10 of a point, that's going to be way more impactful close to P than it is out here. So that's what that said. And the closer you get to P, the more impactful a given marginal change is. So there's some compression on this axis, which isn't really shown, but that's what this is saying. All right, so that's price. That's one of our three axes. Now we're going to move to debt level. Debt level is also reflexive in the sense that at higher debt levels, Beanstalk requires higher temperatures to attract lenders, and therefore there's more debt issuance. So at higher debt levels, there tends to be more debt issuance than at lower debt levels. So there's still some reflexivity here. However, there's much less reflexivity than with respect to price. And worse than that, or I guess not worse than that, but much worse, not to say that the former is bad, but this is very bad, is that Beanstalk has no idea what are the actual values at which the reflexivity of debt level is going to be experienced. Whereas if you think about it, price is so obvious, right? Particularly when it comes to setting V. So it is easy to understand where generally the orientation of this this shape is. When it comes to the debt level, it's much harder to understand the orientation. Why? Because it's unclear at what debt levels it will really cause a change in the interest rate required for Beanstalk to attract lenders. However, we can still say that at lower debt levels, a marginal change in debt level is likely to have a much larger effect on the debt level Beanstalk needs to pay than the same change in debt level at much higher debt levels. At some point, that may change into sort of like a runaway debt level, where Beanstalk has to pay a much higher rate, but Beanstalk's strategy is just not to pay that rate and wait it out instead of paying an infinite rate. And now with the introduction of conversions, it often doesn't need to pay an egregious rate at all. So this is an approximation of what debt level looks like. There are some significant points here we're talking about. Excuse me. And they're made up. They're just like reference points to better understand the shape of debt level. But there's some point at which we don't know if this is actually where it is or if it's over here or over here. But there's some point at which the system is so healthy that it's able to issue as much debt as desired at low interest rates, such that the debt level really doesn't increase quickly. So even when the price decreases, Beanstalk can just issue as much debt as it wants at very low interest rates, and therefore the debt level is just not going to increase very quickly. Once you get above A, the debt level is going to start to increase more quickly until you get to B, which is the point at which the debt level is healthy, but it's unhealthy enough that it becomes harder if you're going this direction or easier if you're going this direction to attract creditors. And so at this point, you actually see an increase in the interest rate that Beanstalk needs to pay, and an increase in the reflexivity. So whereas here you have downward force, there's some point at which the force actually changes, and then now Beanstalk, for the marginal change and increase in debt level, Beanstalk is having a harder time, which is always the case, which is sort of the thing that makes showing this value a little bit difficult, is that it's unclear at what value this actually changes for the debt level. We don't know in practice what are the levels at which the debt level changing really affects the relationship between the interest rate Beanstalk has to pay and debt level. So that's it's a little bit unclear. Should it be flatter? Should the curve be a little bit more to the left, a little bit more centered? A little bit unclear. The reason that it's stretched out like this flat to the right is because as the temperature gets higher and higher, as we've experienced, there becomes a point where the marginal increase in debt level doesn't really affect as much the temperature at which Beanstalk needs to issue things, and therefore the debt level is less reflexive with respect to itself at much higher debt levels. But of course, there is a point at which there is real significant reflexivity demonstrated, where the small marginal change in debt level results in a really significant change in the positive force on debt level itself. Now, last but not least is L2SR, the liquidity to supply ratio. Now, the interesting thing is that the L2SR is flat, meaning that at higher or lower liquidity levels, Beanstalk doesn't really have anything to say with regards to higher or low liquidity. What's up, Harry? Welcome. Come join us. Maybe come up here. Say hi. Anyways, the L2SR is flat, unlike the previous two dimensions. And what this basically means is that for a given change in the L2SR, in the level of liquidity, there is no real change in the force acting on the liquidity level with respect to liquidity. Higher liquidity levels don't really beget higher liquidity levels, and lower liquidity levels don't beget lower liquidity. However, there is a significant change in the scale of Beanstalk with respect to L2SR at lower or higher liquidity. Because at lower liquidity levels, the liquidity level changes very quickly. On higher liquidity levels, the liquidity changes very quickly. But the point is that the direction in which the liquidity changes is neutral with respect to liquidity. So that's why it's flat. So the scale is represented here to sort of demonstrate that at lower liquidity levels, for a given force applied, more distance will be covered in space in practice. That's what this compression over here shows. And then at very high liquidity levels, there's just less of a significant change in liquidity. You could argue that it should all be constant because a given change in liquidity changes the liquidity a fixed amount. But when it comes to the health of Beanstalk in particular, there's a lot more volatility between 0.1 and 0.12 and 0.15 versus 8.1 and 8.2 and 8.5. So, and it's also much harder for Beanstalk to go from 8 to 8.5. Just in terms of it takes more force. Okay, now couldn't big liquidity running out the door trigger small participants to also run out the door? Sure, but now you're talking about like momentum. Sorry, just taking a drink. Well, the reality is that would likely come out in the form of price, right? So a decrease in liquidity levels, but a constant price, that's not necessarily going to lead to lower liquidity. It may lead to lower prices, but it's just as likely at lower liquidity levels, assuming all else is equal, for the liquidity level to increase or decrease from there. I think as opposed to price and debt level, liquidity level is less reflexive. Maybe there's an argument to be made it should have a slight bend to it, but it should be much less than the debt level or the price. And as we'll see, as the axes start to get combined, there's natural curvature introduced anyways, along the lines that you're talking about, arrow mirror. Okay, so now that we've talked about the shape and scale, at least briefly, of each axis, I guess we didn't talk about the scale of the debt level, but it's so hard to know what it actually looks like. So yeah, we're just going to pass over it, even though it is treated in this document. And now let's talk about direction and acceleration. So given the shape and scale, what can we say about, if we know position along an axis, what can we say about the movement of Beanstalk? One axis at a time. So we start with price. When P is greater than V, the force is positive. So it's heading when it's down, it's heading down. When it's less than V, it's heading down. Less than V prime, really. And then in terms of acceleration, the more P increases above V prime, the more positive force there is. So there's acceleration, and you would see that if, you can see that there's a more and more downward force naturally being applied. So what does this look like for debt level? Similar, although we don't know the shape, but there's some point B at which point greater than there's upward force and more upward force than downward force, right? So net positive upward force, positive downward force. And similarly, it accelerates, but we don't really know the shape of this axis, not nearly as much as price. And then L2SR, because it's flat, there's no directional force here. So what? We've got the shape and the scale. We've got the direction and acceleration. How does that help us? Well, if we understand things in one dimension, we can put them together in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions until we come to some sort of understanding of what's actually going on. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about price and debt level. And we're going to try to treat price and debt level somewhat fully because that's the way the current peg maintenance mechanism works. So let's see if by understanding the shape, scale, direction, and acceleration of price and debt level, if we can understand how Beanstalk currently works. And then from there, we can try to expand it and understand some of the changes that are being proposed, and then also understand, of course, the major change to the peg maintenance model. Okay. So, question 1.4, just to restate it, is given the shape and scale of each axis, what can Beanstalk infer about the state of Beanstalk in terms of derivatives of position? So direction and acceleration. Now, we did it in 1 dimension, but now we're going to try to do it in 2 dimensions. And so the questions to think about in order to answer this larger question are as follows. If you want to understand the interplay between price and debt level, so we want to understand how does price act differently upon itself at various debt levels? How does debt level act differently upon itself at various prices? What is the shape and scale of the 2-dimensional price and debt level? And then given the shape and scale of the 2-dimensional space, price, and debt level, what can we infer about Beanstalk state in terms of derivatives of position, so direction and acceleration? So can we take the exercise that we just did in 1 dimension and now sort of stitch together the spaces into 2 dimensions? Now, hold on, this is a little sloppy. Let's see if we can fix this. It's just so funky. But we persist. Beautiful. A, what are the effects of debt level on price? So how does price act differently at different debt levels? Now, let's just think about this intuitively. At lower debt levels, it's much easier for Beanstalk is healthier, of course. So it's much easier for Beanstalk's price to pump. There's less debt. There's less new harvests happening, or the harvests that are happening might be newer, so they're less likely to sell versus reinvest. So it's much easier for the price to pump when there's lower debt. And it's much harder for the price to dump very low when the system is healthy and can, in theory, issue debt than at higher debt levels. At higher debt levels, it's much harder for the price to pump because there's so much debt outstanding. Even when debt starts to be paid back, people can be skeptical, and it's much easier for the system to enter a death spiral with the price plummeting. So that's reflected in this arrow diagram, and then this is reflected in 2 dimensions, which I think is much more easy to visualize with something like this, where you can sort of see like lower debt levels. There's much more of a tendency towards a very high price, and it's harder for Beanstalk to approach a low price. Whereas at low debt levels, at high debt level, down here, it's very easy for at low debt levels, it's much easier for the price to increase. Whereas at high debt levels, it's much easier for the price to decrease. And then there's obviously some sort of neutral debt level here. That is sort of the center point, which was that curve that we were looking at a little bit before. So that is sort of the shape of price. What does price look like? What is the force of price on itself at different debt levels? Now, we switch it around. At different debt levels, at different prices, how does debt level act differently? Now, of course, when the price is greater than its value peg, Beanstalk is minting. So the debt level decreases. And when the price is less than V, Beanstalk is borrowing beans. And so the debt level increases. So we didn't really understand the shape of debt level to begin with, per se. But we do understand that at really high prices, the debt level comes down. And at very low prices, the debt level increases. Now, there's a sort of a question here, like, why does this look like this? Why isn't it just straight down? And just to explain it quickly, it's so that this is expressing that higher prices, the shape of debt level with respect to itself is still reflexive. So there is still some still some debt level, at which point the total force on debt level is still up, more positive with respect to debt level. However, that force is going to be very small if it's there, whereas the vast majority of the time it's going to be a downward force. But it's still there, so it's not. It wouldn't be correct for this to be going straight down. What does this look like stretched out? Something like this. So you can see again, low prices, it's much easier for the debt level to increase. And high prices, it's much easier for the debt level to decrease. So now the question is, we have these 2 spaces. Can we stitch them together to understand the 2-dimensional space? So we have these 2 spaces, but the problem is that their axes don't align. So here we have price, here we have debt level, here we have price, here we have debt level. So what are we going to do? We got to rotate one. So we rotate, and now you can see, low debt level, high debt level, high debt level, low price, high price, high price. Voila! And better than just the axes line up, you can see that the shape also lines up to some extent. Where at high debt level and low price, there's a curvature down into lower and lower levels. And at high prices and high debt levels, excuse me, at high debt levels and low prices, there's a tendency downward, and at low debt levels and high prices, there's a tendency upward, and then it's more neutral in the other corners. And it's actually the same trend illustrated here. And so we can somewhat intuitively stitch the space together, and this is what we get. So here we see the very low debt level line. Discord's chroma subsampling makes the colored lines rather faint. I'm sorry about that. Great. I'm glad zooming in helps. I'll try to zoom in if it's not clear. Let me know. But remember, there's also the PDF and the Arweave link. Wonderful. Okay. So this is the stitched together space. Now the features here we're talking about are at a very low price, the system is never going to have an increasing debt level. So here in practice, even though you still have this reflexivity, now that you've actually merged the spaces, we do have that trend that we were talking about before, because the debt level is never increasing when the price is low. And in fact, it's never increasing when the price is only a little bit low. It's also not going to decrease when it's neutral. It's only going to start to decrease at higher prices. That's reflected in these orange and red lines. Whereas price, you do have some sort of still reflexivity maintained at various debt levels, even though at high debt levels, it's much more of a tendency towards a low price, and at low debt levels, it's much more of a tendency to high price. But the really interesting thing is that you can see there's sort of these two holes that the system falls into. And you would say, well, what's the big problem with falling into this hole back here where you have a very low debt level and a very high price? Sounds like Jubilee. I'm sure Harry Smith would be very happy if we were hanging out over here and there was lots of minting and no debt. But of course, the amount of force that it would take to get the system out of here would almost certainly, because it's so steep and deep, would almost certainly force Beanstalk over here into a debt cycle with low price and high debt level, which is, of course, what we've experienced in the past, right? When the system pumps, it, of course, dumps. So that's what this is showing. The system clearly has a tendency to pump and a tendency to dump. And it's good to know that the intuitive understanding for how the spaces merge together really do show that clearly. This is what this diagram looks like in 2 dimensions, where you can see the tendency towards the holes. And then here, we just turned it so that you could see there's, the tendency towards the same holes. There's an orientation of the same axes. There's a little cheat sheet for people to look at for later. This is a more formal discussion of the shape and scale than the one we just had, and the direction and acceleration. But the point is, I think, quite clear. If you're over here, you're heading down here, you're naturally accelerating down here. And if you're over here, you're naturally accelerating here. It's quite clear. So the cool thing about understanding this space is that it's very clear what's happening to Beanstalk. Is it when the price is higher than V prime, it falls into this hole, and when the price is higher than lower than V prime, it falls into this hole. Now, of course, we're weighing out here with a high price, so it's relatively non-reflexive. But the system's basically hanging out here right now. That's what's going on. So it's got a little bit of an uphill climb with respect to debt level when it's just hanging on a V. That's what's experiencing now. But it's, of course, liable to fall here and die, or fall over here pay everyone off at some point. So that's what's going on. But of course, it's dipped down here. Hasn't really gone up here yet, but that's what's going on. Okay. Now that we feel like we've answered 1.4 sufficiently, like what's going on in 2 dimensions, how should Beanstalk actually evaluate its position, direction, and acceleration at the beginning of each season in practice? Because it's gotta act at the beginning of each season. This is how it maintains peg. So first, there's a question of time. Should it measure more than one season? Should it measure just the previous season? Given, as we're seeing, there's a lot of complexity here. I think that the general preference should be to keep things as simple as possible. And therefore, Beanstalk being sort of just responding to its previous season as opposed to an extended period of time seems to be the most intuitive. But of course, a more sophisticated peg maintenance model could factor in more time, but not not immediately. That would be, at least in my opinion, significantly more complicated. So, how should Beanstalk measure price? As we were talking about earlier, Beanstalk uses delta B generally as a proxy for price. Currently, it does entirely, but because now we have Q, which is when the price is too high, of course, Beanstalk does have to check the price when delta B is positive. So there is now some actual dimension of time, in which case Beanstalk uses the time weighted price and the same time weighted values that are used to calculate delta B, and then it evaluates price relative to Q. And that only goes into effect when seed gauge goes up. Debt level. Beanstalk currently uses the pod rate. You can make an argument that it should use the FERT as well because that's debt. However, that Beanstalk has never been upgraded to include debt in the to include fertilizer, in the debt level calculation, just because there's so many pods compared to FERT that by the time all the FERT is paid off, the pod rate will still be just excessively high. So it just seems like debt work that doesn't get anywhere. So that's why that hasn't been worked on to date, as far as I understand. So the point is, Beanstalk uses the pod rate to represent debt level, even though, of course, including FERT would be more perfect. So Beanstalk evaluates the debt level, and it classifies it as very low, low, high, or very high, depending on its reference to these 3 points: DR lower, DR star, and DR upper. The tricky part, as we were discussing, is that we have no idea where A, B, and C are in practice, and so setting DR lower, DR star, and DR upper is very much more art than science. Setting them properly is quite difficult in practice. Now, tending towards the lower side is safer, but it's unclear how those should be set perfectly. Right now, it doesn't seem to be the most important thing to figure out, but at some point, it would be good to spend more time on it. Okay, so given that this is how we're analyzing them in one dimension each, what about 2 dimensions? It's the composite of the 2. So we have 2 cases for price right now and 4 cases for debt level. In the future, we'll have a 3rd case for price. And now the question is, well, Beanstalk is evaluating its position, direction, and acceleration. Well, with respect to what? So there's some ideal level set, right? V and DR star, the optimal debt level and the optimal price. The optimal price and the optimal debt level, I should say. Which Beanstalk is regularly trying to oscillate across. In particular across V, but also across the optimal debt level. But right now, Beanstalk is just oscillating across V, and it's now oscillating across debt. So it's doing an okay job, given that the price is the main thing that it's focused on. You could say it's doing okay, but of course the debt level is fair. So there's this ideal equilibrium, this place where Beanstalk wants to be, where equilibrium, of course, would imply some sort of stability. So you would need not just for price to be at V and debt level to be at DR star, but you would also need demand for soil to be steady. And why is this? It's because demand for soil is really a proxy that Beanstalk uses to understand its health and its momentum, and in particular, Beanstalk's ability to issue debt to respond to the market. So minting beans, it's always a quick response to price when the price is too high. But can Beanstalk actually affect the market by borrowing from the market? So can Beanstalk actually affect price by borrowing from the market? So that's the main indicator for Beanstalk's ability to apply force as needed to the system. And so that's the other indicator here. And so what Beanstalk is doing in order to try to get to ideal equilibrium, which again is price oscillating across V, debt level at or oscillating across GR star, and demand from soil being steady. Well, how does it do it? It tries to understand, well, what is its direction? We understood that Beanstalk is naturally falling into these two holes. So when Beanstalk is, when the price is greater than 1, as we were saying, the direction is always here. And when the price is less than 1, it's less than the value peg is always in this direction. And we, ideal equilibrium is going to be somewhere like here. Somewhere like here. So the question is, what is Beanstalk's direction with regards to ideal equilibrium? And naturally, you would say it's sort of moving towards it here and then away from it here, and then towards it here and then away from it here. But it's really naturally accelerating away from it, and accelerating towards it, and accelerating, et cetera, et cetera. But through using demand for soil, through using measuring Beanstalk's ability to apply force, particularly in this direction, because Beanstalk can always, through minting, apply force in this direction. Beanstalk can measure whether or not it's accelerating or decelerating in these directions. So that's generally how the current peg maintenance works. There's 2 prices, 4 debt levels, and then 3 measurements for demand for soil, and that's where the current 24 cases come from, where it's either accelerating, steady, or decelerating based on demand for soil towards or away from ideal equilibrium based on the direction that is implied from the price and the debt level. So that's how the current system is measured. That's how Beanstalk measures what's going on. And basically, before we move on to talking about how this works for the other dimensions, it's probably a good idea to sort of pause and talk about how Beanstalk actually, in practice, classifies state, classifies what's going on, and then responds to state in 2 dimensions before we move on to 3 dimensions. So I see we have a question here. So before we move on to Beanstalk's sort of response, let's see what Quasimath says. I thought the debt level seems to increase the most when the price is below 1, but there is enough faith in the system that people actually sow. So the debt level in some ways is more likely to increase at 98.90. This is captured by the 3D model. I lost track of the axes. Well, the axes are price and debt level in these diagrams. But the point is, your question is really trying to get at the shape of the debt level and saying the relationship between price and debt level. And so is the debt level more likely to increase at 98 cents than 90 cents? The debt level can only decrease at both of those prices. However, it is likely to decrease it can only increase at those prices. However, it is likely to increase more. Sure, it may be more likely to increase at 98 or more likely to increase at 90. But the point is that the way that the system will issue debt is that at 90 cents, it will have to issue much more debt. The debt level will have to increase much more in order to return to peg. So that's really what this is saying. Like the effective price on debt level is that it will have to at 90 cents, Beanstalk will have to issue much more debt in order to return to peg. I hope that answers your question. Just waiting for him to respond. Okay. So the model ignored whether the lending actually occurred? No, it does not. That's where demand for soil comes into play. But that's just Beanstalk's measurement with respect to it. But the point is that the model is accounting for this in the sense that it is showing that at lower prices, the debt level is more likely to increase and more likely to increase faster with respect to itself. Sure, you could have the situation where there's no demand for soil. But without the silo, that would typically be a situation where the system would just fall and collapse. So it's only due to the efficacy of the silo at this point that that's not the case. All right, next question. Price is at equilibrium at prime because at V there is no minting, which means there's no positive force. Is that right? Yes, that's exactly right. It's true indeed. But it's not just no positive force, there's some negative force because there's no minting happening. So people are like, why am I here? There's no opportunity cost when there's no minting. So if V prime equal to the risk, representative of what is like sort of the risk-free rate, probably in some capacity. All right. Let's get into what Beanstalk is actually doing in its current peg maintenance model. So we revisited these 4 questions responding to state. 1, what is the natural flow of state given its position? So what's happening to Beanstalk in this 2-dimensional state? 2, what tools does Beanstalk have available to perform peg maintenance? 3, how do these tools affect position? And then how should Beanstalk actually use these tools? So natural flow, price times debt level. This is sort of talking about what we said earlier, where when the price is above the debt level, there's this tendency upward. Where there's prices upwardly reflexive, there's a tendency upward in terms of price, but there's also a tendency downward in terms of debt level. And you could argue that these arrows should be more to the left, but this was an older diagram. I didn't get into updating. But the point is that at some point you get over here, and then you collapse. The system collapses, and then there ends up being a downward spiral, and then goes over here. So to the extent possible, the goal is to keep the system around here. Now, what can Beanstalk actually do within this space? Well, it can mint beans, it can mint soil, and it can change the temperature. And because price is the most important thing for the peg maintenance model, minting beans and minting soil is currently independent of the debt level. And so Beanstalk uses the time-weighted average delta B to determine how many beans or how much soil to mint. So if Beanstalk is average about here, it figures out, okay, well, it needs X amount of beans to be sold to return back to peg, and it mints those beans, or vice versa. If it's here and it needs X amount of beans to be bought at the margin to return to peg, it creates that amount of soil. One interesting open discussion is, should it multiply by some sort of scalar that amount based on the debt level or the liquidity level? I'd argue probably not. We talk about that a little bit in here somewhere, but the general gist of it is that if you're going to over mint beans when you're going to create inorganic demand, and if you're going to under mint beans, you're also probably going to create inorganic demand because then the system's going to not return to peg fast. So it's a lose-lose. There's also a couple other reasons, which are defined later. Yeah, but have limited time, so don't want to just. I mean, I could talk for hours, forever and ever about all this stuff. We've spent so much time thinking about all this stuff and talking about it. So yeah, I'm gonna try to keep it somewhat brief, although I understand we've been going for 90 minutes already. And we're not even a third of the way through the document. So what can Beanstalk do? It can mint beans, it can mint soil, and it can change the temperature. And the interesting thing is and then it also can sell beans on the open market via something like the flood, which is when it's over here. It can sort of return its position back to the value peg, pay off all of its debt, so it's right back here. And then by paying off all the debt, sending back to pay, there's some sort of natural downward force to send it back over here. So instead of being over here, the flood sort of says, no, you can't be over here. You got to stay over here. So that's like the, that's what the flood is doing. The flood initially, when it has that mass harvest, it sort of sends force over here, like a downward force. But that's a response to the fact that there was just the initial flood. But after that, it just sort of returns it back here, and then the system can just sort of flow naturally. It's unclear whether it dip into the flood or at some point it just sort of starts to trickle out here. So debt level, it can mint beans, it can mint soil, and it can change the temperature, and it can mint beans. It can sell beans. How should it do this thing? Well, it depends how these tools affect its position along these axes. So when Beanstalk is applying that leaf blower, what is the direction of the force and the strength of the force of that leaf blower on Beanstalk? Fundamentally, as a design principle, anytime Beanstalk mints beans, it pays off debt. So when the price decreases through minting, the debt level also decreases, and vice versa. Anytime the price increases through the issuance of debt, the debt level increases. So there's a high amount of correlation between excuse me, between the effect of these two tools and the price and the debt level. And raising the temperature means Beanstalk is willing to issue more debt to raise delta B by the same amount, and lowering the temperature means it's willing to issue less debt. So it's a change in the changing the amount of beans or changing the amount of soil minted would change the amount of force with respect to price, but changing the and I guess also with respect to debt level, so because it's along these axes, but then changing the temperature sort of to what extent is the slope of the axis. So you have these green lines that are sort of showing the trade-off between price and debt level, and the point is the more beans and the more soil, the more force along these lines that Beanstalk is trying to apply to counteract the red force, and then the higher the temperature, the more upward force. Excuse me. As the temperature goes up, there is more debt issuance being issued, so there's more pressure this way. So the slope has to come. The slope has to come down. So, all right. I see a couple new questions have come in. Given that the debt has even very high interest rates make it unattractive for long-term Beanstalk, does this not create another hole? That is the hole that is. See, we're covering a lot of ground. Don't beat this much. That's this hole. This is the high debt level hole. Right here. So high debt level leads to higher debt level. Low price leads to higher debt level. Lower price. This is the hole. And would it not, thus not be possible to use a metric of health, the velocity at which debt is paid back? Sure. But that is downstream of the minting, and it's not downstream of the supply. It's another valuable thing to consider. But at the end of the day, should Beanstalk really be changing what it's doing because it's like changing the amount of debt that's been paid back recently? That's more of a question of like the time to factor things in over. It's not. I'm not saying that it's a bad metric to use, but for the time being, it's better to keep things much simpler. But in theory, measuring like the rate at what at the time over which, if things continue, Beanstalk will pay off debt. That's not an unreasonable thing for it to measure, but probably not the most base level thing for it to measure in the grand scheme of things. Okay, where were we? We were here. Cool. Decreasing the temperature would basically increase the slope, so there's less of a trade-off. Increasing the temperature, more slope, more of a trade-off. Okay, one really interesting question is, should Beanstalk be more or less aggressive at raising the temperature when it is close to a death spiral here? Now, I would argue that the thing to do is to be less aggressive, because raising the temperature puts more force this way, which to me is sort of going with the tide. The thing to do is for Beanstalk to be aggressive and say it's just not going to issue more debt at higher rates. So it should really be less aggressive in raising temperature, which is more aggressive, I think, in the grand scheme of things, and try to move the directional force this way. So whether that means lowering the temperature, unclear, but I definitely don't think increasing the temperature much at higher debt levels is necessarily the most productive thing, particularly with what we're seeing like now, for example. That's an interesting topic of discussion. Pizza Man says, but then Bean is on the peg for longer, which is also not good for Bean's creditworthiness. Sure, but if it's going to issue debt at an infinite debt interest rate, it's going to collapse. So there's just a trade-off there. And an interesting angle as well, depending on the level of liquidity, maybe it can just incentivize converts instead. A very interesting new trade-off exists there between the silo and the field being used for peg maintenance. Okay. So, given what we know about price and debt level and the fact that Beanstalk could collapse, what do we want the force supply to sort of look like, right? This is what we want. We want, once the force has been applied, this is the new net effect on the system we want. When it's at a low price and a low debt level, sort of naturally comes up slowly. When it's at a higher debt level, the system is more aggressive at not over issuing debt. Excuse me. Of course, at high prices, we want the debt level to come down in addition to price. And then here, it's really hard to prevent it from entering the flood, but then the flood returns it to where it's supposed to be. Oh, I see lots of chatter in the chat. So before we talk about Beanstalk's peg maintenance response, let's see what the gang is chatting about. Okay. Quasi-math. I thought the debt level seems to increase the most when the price is below 1. But there's enough faith in the system that people aren't. Oh, we already talked about that. Sorry, Discord confusing me. Oh, we answered all of them. All right, never mind. I don't know why Discord is telling me it's new. Oh, I think I lost the screen. Did I lose the screen? I think my iPad locked.
Yeah, you just unshared.
Sorry, my accident. My mistake. Share my screen. Share my screen. Don't.
There's also the 2 questions from earlier that you were gonna wait on.
Oh, that's a good.
Mixolydian and Hiromiru.
All right, is the screen share back?
Yes.
All right, we're gonna get to both of these. But if I don't get to them, I'll probably get to the first one today, and the second one we might have to get to tomorrow. We'll see. Hard to keep people here for more than 2 hours at a time. All right, screen share's back. Everyone can see this. See the circles.
Looks good.
Great. Okay, so what is Beanstalk actually doing? When delta B is positive, it's minting beans. When delta B is negative, it's minting soil, both times equal to delta B. When the delta B is negative, when the delta B is positive, the Beanstalk still mints some beans to be able to measure demand for soil. And then it changes the max temperature based on position, direction, and acceleration. So, I'm sure we've all spent a fair amount of time trying to understand what in God's name is going on in these charts. In the white paper graphics about temperature, but this is basically what it's saying is for a given debt level and a given position, direction and acceleration, in addition to position, debt level and price, just debt level in this case, and then direction and acceleration. What is the change in maximum temperature? Or alternatively, given the debt level and the price, and change in demand for soil, what is the conditions? And they're matched up. Now, one thing that's very interesting is that based on this study, it may make sense to actually change the maximum temperature change to be more aggressive at lower debt levels, right? Apply more force here to try to get up on price here. Take the chance while the system can't, when it has low debt. Sure, do what it can to just get here, as opposed to slow rolling it, and then the system can really have a full outflow. So it can aggressively raise temperature here, and then be less aggressive at raising temperature over here. Whereas right now it does the opposite. It's more aggressive at raising temperature here and less here. So one thing to think about is whether to switch this. Other future work on this stuff. How to measure A, B, and C. How to set DR lower, DR star, DR upper with regards to A, B, and C. Measuring acceleration of price in addition to the acceleration of delta B. The acceleration of the system with regards to debt level with demand for soil. We currently use, we don't do that for price. So should we use some measure of, acceleration or health for price, other than just the position itself for delta B. Measuring demand for soil is something that's always very complicated. We didn't talk about that today, but it's covered in the document. How to set Q, and whether there's some natural opposite of Q is a good topic of discussion or research for the future. Something that's come to mind is a mini flood, where it's like the system really won't let the system flow above Q, so it'll just automatically sell back to PEG and then distribute BDB to people, distribute liquidity. Maybe it just auto adds the liquidity and then sends out LP tokens or deposits. It's like instead of selling out of the system, like just compounds it. Whereas right now the flood is sort of like removes the value from the system. It's like some sort of like auto compounding flood on that. That's not included in this list. And then, I think the most interesting, although difficult, is we have this model for two holes. And right now, Beanstalk is measuring things with respect to direction and acceleration with respect to ideal equilibrium here. But the question is, should it be measuring things here? Like, should it have a two-hole model versus a single point model? If that makes sense. But that's a very complicated discussion. So that's the current state of the discussion about things. Is maybe it should work like that. But it's hard to know. So with all this in mind, this is sort of how Beanstalk currently works, more or less. We can sort of take this analysis that we did in 2 dimensions and the discussion about how Beanstalk responded to it and used its tools to affect the force in the right way or apply force with the lawnmower in the right way to change position as best as it can. We can use the same strategy to now try to expand things to 3 dimensions. Now, of course, 3 dimensions are much harder to visualize, particularly if you keep in mind, like we've been visualizing like things in 1 extra dimension. So the shape of the system in 2 dimensions this is shown in 3 dimensions, even though it's only covered 2 dimensions. To show 3 dimensions, you would require 4 dimensions, which is obviously not really visually intuitive. So we're just gonna have to use our brains and our imagination to a large extent. So that's what we will do next. I see we have a couple more questions here. If you flip the temperature increases when debt level is high, won't that cause the interest rate to eventually converge at 0? And thus make it so that Beanstalk is solely reliant on convert to lead peg. Well, the temperature would this proposed flip would mean that Beanstalk is still raising the temperature. It's just raising the temperature more aggressively at lower debt levels and less aggressively at higher debt levels. But it's still raising the temperature. So it's not saying don't raise the temperature. It's just raising it slow. And then next question, not raising temp when debt level is super high. You have to pull some other level. Like in that case, there would be an additional incentive to convert. Exactly. That's exactly right. So in those cases, perhaps Beanstalk could more aggressively incentivize converts before it tries to increase the debt level aggressively. So it now has multiple dimensions of levers on which it can operate. So this is now we can get into, the other 2 dimensions on which Beanstalk is operating and, how Beanstalk responds to it. Now, just personally, like I said, I could talk about this forever. I think maybe it makes more sense to sort of see if there are any more questions now and try to wrap it up at the top of the hour before that, and then resume this tomorrow and sort of begin the discussion with the price times debt level, 2-dimensional space, and then we can do the debt level and it's the price and liquidity level, then the debt level and liquidity level, and then all 3 of them together, and then Beanstalk's new response to it under the gauge system. And then we'll probably need a 3rd day to talk about all the other related stuff and the other RFCs that are unrelated. So if people are cool with having a 3rd day of class instead of this going on for another hour and a half, that's probably better. So if people have questions, feel free to drop them. I'll hang out for a minute or 2, and if there are no more questions, we can just resume tomorrow. But obviously, there's a lot of content. Maybe tomorrow at the beginning of class, there can be a period of time for people to ask questions once they've, reviewed this, because I know it's a lot. Let's see. For the convert changes, look at the generalized convert. There will be, there's a lot of content about gen convert in this document, so feel free to review it. Is the temp currently too high? Would you prefer it increase at a slower rate than it currently does? Yes, the temp is too damn high, and yes, it is increasing way too fast. I think, like I said, it's one thing that the study clearly demonstrates is that at this point in the state space, raising the temperature is actually counterproductive because it would basically point or orient the leaf blower more in this direction as opposed to in this direction. So yeah, lower temperature is definitely good at this point, given that there's no demand for soil. So whenever there is demand for soil, it's probably going to come in at if it comes in at this rate, it can come in at a slightly lower rate, probably too. So are we nearing a death spiral? Everything is in the eye of the beholder, but Beanstalk has done pretty well over the past couple months with significant downside price volatility and ultimately returning. So unlikely. I see someone still typing, so let's see if they put anything in the chat for us to talk about. In the future work section, that last point mentions a peg maintenance mechanism relative to the two holes. How would that work if we really don't know the shape of things? I guess my question is, how do we find out where the tipping point for all charts are? We don't really know. But I guess the point is, like, right now, everything is like, where are things compared to ideal equilibrium? What is the direction and acceleration with respect to ideal equilibrium? Whereas, like, maybe you could say another way of thinking about the same exact information is what is its position, direction, acceleration with respect to the two holes. So it's just another way to think about the response, if that makes sense. It doesn't, nothing really changes per se. It's just another way to think about things. I guess my question is, how do we find out where the tipping points for all charts are? In practice. That's it. We get data in practice. And our intuition, right? Like the change in, the interest rate necessary between a 1,000% debt level and a 2,000% debt level versus a 0% interest rate and 100% interest rate. Hard to reason exactly about those changes, but probably at 1,000% debt level and a 2,000% debt level, the system it has a really high debt level, so the exact interest rate isn't necessarily the most important. Have you thought about ways to add utility to pods debt such that there would be a demand for them irrespective of minting to pay it back? No. Haven't spent too much time on that at the moment. Not to introduce a buzzword, but could AI help pinpoint these? We need data to use AI, and we don't really have any data for something like this. There's still a little typing. Obviously, this doesn't make for great audio content, but want to be respectful of the person typing out their question. Oh, no, they're not typing. All right, so we'll probably wrap it here for today. Same time tomorrow, time and place. I guess the only wrinkle is, I got jury duty tomorrow, so I think I'll be able to start at the same time. But worst case, I got to start a little bit later. But looking forward to continuing this discussion in 2 and 3 dimensions. Hope people found this helpful and educational and inspiring.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. We'll try to post some announcement of how far in the doc we are and our new plan for probably having at least a couple more of these over the next couple days. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.